work practices for an ICT worker working in the ICT industry. In this section, we're really going to be looking at things like task and time management, a little bit around sustainability, feedback, and the customer service side of our job. So again, HSC syllabus content directly related to the examination. This is from Unit 2, working in the ICT industry, specifically subsection number 5, work practices. So to get started, we think work practices, this is the way that we do our work, okay? The practices are aimed at facilitating efficiency in the workplace, usually designed against industry standards and policies, following IT policies and IT processes. When we complete the tasks in the IT industry, some of the examples of work practices that we need to consider include whether we're sticking to the safety procedures, following directions from our supervisors or managers, our presentation standards. We spoke about that in our previous slide. We're talking about what you should be wearing when you're at work. The maintenance of personal workspace and making sure that you're looking after your desk or work environment, and how you contribute to a productive work environment by accepting responsibility for the work that you do and doing it to a really high standard, a standard that you're proud to say is your own. And where required, assisting your co-workers, right? Not just leaving them out on their own, but actually looking after the people you work with. So there are a couple of different industry standards we need to know about. Now, the definition of an industry standard is basically the recognized way across an industry that things get done. Standards exist for a whole heap of things like programming languages, operating systems, data formats, communication protocols, electrical interfaces, a whole heap of different stuff there. From a user standpoint, standards are important because it means that I can get computing parts from different manufacturers, different systems, and bring them together to work. For example, right now I'm using a iMac, okay, an Apple Macintosh product. It's connected to a Laser branded USB mouse. It's then connected to a Hewlett-Packard USB keyboard. It has a Logitech branded web camera attached to it at the moment for some web conferencing that I've been doing. And all of these different bits of hardware work with the Apple iMac because of industry standards, because everyone has agreed this is how a USB port is going to work, and this is what it's going to look like, and this is how they're going to connect together, and this is how they're going to talk to computers. Thanks to standards, I'm able to save myself some cash from having to buy Apple-specific products for my Apple device. So it's really handy to have industry standards from a user's perspective. Without standard, it would mean that if I had an Apple, I would only be able to use Apple devices. Now, I know that's the dream of companies like Apple, to have to use their dongles and have to use their peripherals, but the reality is there's almost always a generic option that can be used because of these industry standards. I know it's sometimes quite difficult, but there's usually options out there. Some of the standards that we refer to, so ANSI standards, the American National Standards Institute, the International Telecommunication Union, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the International Standards Organization, and the Video Electronic Standards Association. There's a whole heap of standards we refer to, but without even knowing the specific standards, we quite often follow a lot of these. Now, at a really basic level, ISO, where would you be familiar with ISO? Well, if you think of a piece of A4 paper, the fact that you know exactly how big an A4 piece of paper is, and that when you buy A4 paper, you know it's going to fit in your printer, that's thanks to the ISO standard for paper. Okay, that is a direct standard, which is the size of an A4 piece of paper, comes from that international standard. Okay? So let's talk then, we're going back to work practices. What are these policies and procedures that we follow when we are specifically doing our IT work? Well, we'll get started with policies. There are different policies that organizations have that you need to follow to make sure you meet the expectations of that company. For example, a purchasing policy. A purchasing policy would be a document that says, this is how we purchase goods and services for our company. These are the limits, these are the suppliers, these are the procedures that we go through to make sure that purchasing happens appropriately. So I know, for example, that when I want to purchase a piece of hardware for my job right now, I need to make sure first and foremost that I have requested that money in my annual budget. Following that, I then need to go and get 2 quotes from 2 different suppliers where possible. I then pass that on to the IT service desk, and they review my system to make sure that what I've got is actually appropriate according to the hardware specifications that my company requires. They then pass it on to the business manager. The business manager says, yes, I'm happy for that purchase to happen. It then goes back to the IT personnel who then make the purchase from the company account. So that's just one very simple example of a policy, but it's really quite complex, and it shows the exact rules that we need to follow when we want to purchase something. We also have policies around standard software, internet access, email usage, naming conventions, network security. There's a whole heap of different policies. I'll give you some examples. So the standard software that we're expected to use in our role here as a teacher at this school is we should be using the Google platform. Now, we can use other software within reason. I can use Microsoft Office where I need to, and I know that I specifically need to for this course quite often. But as a bit of a standard, all of my resources should be stored on Google Drive. We then have standards around policy procedures around internet access. So whatever internet I'm using at work should be work related, should be appropriate, and needs to make sure that I take on responsibility for what happens there. Same goes for email usage. There is an email policy that says that emails are only expected to be read during work hours, and that I have 24 hours to respond to emails. That's a policy. If I don't follow these policies, I can get in trouble from my boss. So that's policies, these are rules. We then have procedures. Procedures are lists of steps that specifically outline the way that we do things. Now, there are specific ways that companies want things done. For example, if I want to attach something to the network here at school, well, I need to first ask permission to connect it. If it's an approved device, I connect it. I then need to notify the IT personnel what port number I'm using. They then configure the port on the network switch to make sure it has access to the appropriate resources. They confirm that that's been done with me. I test it, I let them know that it works, and then the job is closed. And that's the procedure just for setting up a simple printer on the network. There are all sorts of procedures that different companies follow. The way that we document our information, the way that we need to write emails, the sorts of language we need to use, the way that we specifically set up computers for students to use for the first time, the specific way that we go about updating software. There's a whole heap of procedures, the way that we do things. Policies is what we are allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do, so rules. Procedures is the way that we do those things. Quite often, these policies and these procedures are based on the international standards, the industry standards, the Australian standards, but they are also based on legislation. So we've got to consider things like the Health and Safety Act, we've got to consider the Equal Opportunity and Anti-Discrimination Acts, and all of those sorts of concepts as well. We also keep in mind the way that our boss needs us to do it for our job as well, okay, which is usually embedded in all of those procedures. So moving across, in addition to the way that we do things and the things that we do in our job, we also have a whole heap of requirements that we need to follow. We are bound as a company, we are bound by laws, and we must adhere to the legislation and the regulations in our country. Now, these legislations and regulations have already been developed with industry. So industry has already had a chance to have their say, and they're all agreed upon, these legislations. So we need to make sure that we stick to them when we work for these companies, because as workers, we are also bound by these laws. Failure to follow these requirements can be a criminal offence, could result in fines, could result in imprisonment, could be resulting in businesses being forced to shut down. These are the legal requirements. Now, when I talk about legal requirements, I'm looking here about the Health and Safety Act, the Health and Safety Regulation, the EEO Act, and the Anti-Discrimination Act. These are the legislation requirements. We then have our ethical requirements. Ethical requirements, these are things that relate a little bit more around morals and what the public perceives to be right and wrong. They're not bound by law all the time. They can be, but they're not always. But companies still try to operate in an ethical manner to keep a really positive corporate image, to make sure that people are happy to do business with our brand. The practices that outline the way that we behave is all found in ethical-based documentation. And one of the key sources that we look at is the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is sort of a set of rules of how an employee should conduct themselves while at work, the sorts of things they should and shouldn't do, and a lot of it, while based around law, is also tied into other perception-based things that the company wants us to stick to. Now, if you want to find a specific example of a code of conduct, you simply just need to think of the company that you work for, Google and say, Woolworths Code of Conduct or Microsoft Code of Conduct, and it's usually available. When you apply for a job and you're successful and you go for your first day of work and you do your induction, they actually usually at that point show you the Code of Conduct document and ask you to read it, or they read through it with you to make sure you're aware of both the legal but also the ethical requirements of your job. In addition to the company Code of Conduct that we must follow, we also as ICT workers are expected to follow the Australian Computing Society's Code of Ethics, which is another document that sets out the way that we should behave as IT people. It's a little bit more specific around the sorts of things that are appropriate and not appropriate for someone to do if they work in the IT industry. It includes things like, am I doing things that are harmful to society? Like hacking, for example. If I am, then I'm not allowed to do it according to these Code of Ethics. Am I doing something that's going to benefit society to make someone's life easier? If yes, then I'm allowed to do it based on this Code of Ethics. So the Code of Ethics is really broad spectrum, but quite specific about what you can and can't do. Now, what happens when we have poor work practices? The first thing is, if we don't follow the work practices, we become inefficient. The idea here is that when you work at a company, employees always find the fastest and most efficient way to get things done. These should be documented in procedures so that people know how to do it the fast way the first time. Once we've learned the best way, we should teach everyone the best way. And by not following those procedures, those work practices, we become inefficient. When we're inefficient, we end up spending money on people working that are working slower than they should be. Okay? That has financial costs for us. We also potentially lose our reputation when we're not following the ethical requirements or the legal requirements as a company. And when these things start to be traced and we find that maybe one person is responsible, that person may lose their employment. Okay? That may be a serious consequence of not following the work practices of that company. Or it may be that employment is lost because the company can no longer afford to pay people to go to work because they've lost their reputation, they've lost their clients, and therefore they've lost money. The last thing is, when we're thinking about poor work practices, the biggest downfall, I think, is that we miss the opportunity to learn and to get better and to reach our full potential. When we have poor management of policies and procedures, we miss opportunities. We miss opportunities with our clients, with other employees, with other organizations. We miss out on the ability to progress ourselves professionally. Okay? That continual professional development that I've been talking about, where we're constantly trying to make ourselves better and more employable. And when we miss those opportunities, that's a really sad thing. And it misses us not only the opportunity to make money, but the opportunity for us to expand our business, to achieve greater financial success, and have that shared responsibility of improving the business. So the next thing that I'm going to speak about is time and task management. Part of being efficient is your ability to manage your time and manage your jobs or your tasks. There are principles and there are techniques. There are principles that guide the way we do our task management. Some of the principles might be that you should prioritize things. Okay? Some of the principles should be that You should work at things really hard and really efficiently and find the best way to do it following procedures. The exact techniques on how we do that is what makes it successful though. How do we prioritize our tasks? Well, maybe it's a matter of going and getting checklists, writing down all the things we're going to do today, assess them, determine which ones are most important, okay, which ones are most time critical, and making sure we work on those things first. That's a technique that we can use to meet the principles of time and task management. Now, it's very unlikely that in your life you're going to have a job where you go to work each day and you only have one thing to work on. It's very unlikely. Usually you have multiple tasks that you are always balancing. And so when we think of these principles and techniques of time and task management, it's all about every day writing down the list of what you want to achieve and prioritizing them. And knowing that when maybe your boss comes over to you and says, hey, can you do me a favor and work on this job as well for me? You add that to your list, reprioritize, and make sure you're always working on things in the correct order to achieve the requirements of your business. It's not sustainable to have people working hours and hours and hours. It's not sustainable to have people working inefficiently because we lose money. But when we talk about sustainability, we're not just talking about those things. We're also talking about sustainable work practices in terms of the environment and how we sustain our resources for future generations. The way we do our work actually has a really big impact on this. Okay? Are we switching lights off when we're done as a work practice? Are we setting screensavers on our computer, or are we putting our monitors to sleep to try and save energy when our computers are not in use? Are we just throwing our old computers in the bin, or are we recycling them in e-waste disposal systems? Are we, before throwing our computers away, trying to see if there's parts from it that we can salvage and reuse as spares for later times to prevent us from having to buy new ones? These sorts of sustainable work practices are embedded in companies in their policies and their procedures around resource management. And that's an expectation that's across most industries. Part of our work practices is also feedback. Feedback is this process where we let people know how they're doing. How are they progressing at their job? How could they do it better? Feedback can be formal or informal. Feedback can be direct or indirect. It can be positive and negative. We need to know which we should use, when we should use them. We start off with formal versus informal. Informal is where someone comes up to you and they're chatting to you and they say, oh, by the way, you did a really good job of that thing the other day. That's informal. Formal is maybe where they send you an email saying, I'd like to congratulate you, you've been working so hard lately, the team is very thankful, blah, blah, and it's written down and it's really formal. Okay? Formal versus informal. Informal feedback is really beneficial. It's really great to encourage people, to give them a little bit of motivation to get their work done. Okay? But formal feedback might sometimes involve sitting down in a meeting, and it could involve that formal process that you go through to ask for a pay rise. And that comes through the formal feedback process as well. Feedback can be direct and indirect. Direct feedback is where someone comes up to you and speaks to you directly, and they let you know specifically how those things have been going, really specifically. Indirect feedback is a little bit more general. Oh, you've been doing really well at work lately, but it's not very specific. Okay? It's just talking in general about things that you've been doing. And when you're at school and you're thinking of your assessments, you usually receive both direct and indirect feedback. Your teacher might say, oh, overall the whole class has done really well at this and they could have improved at this. That's indirect feedback. And then after that lesson, they might give you your marking guide, and the marking guide gives you your direct specific feedback that says, you need to work on your paragraph structure. I noticed that you have lots of information, but you haven't organized it very well, which has stopped you from accessing the top level marks. That's direct feedback because it's specific to you, specific to the work that you did. Okay? It's very different from that indirect general feedback. Now, positive and negative feedback. Positive feedback is all the good things you've been doing. Negative is obviously the bad things you've been doing. there's a really fine line between negative feedback and being hurtful. And it's important that if you're ever in a position where you're giving people feedback, if you need to give negative feedback, you do it in a respectful manner. You've got to think the whole purpose of feedback at all is to improve. You let people know how they're going so they can get better at it. Now, if you turn to someone and say, you're terrible at this, you should just stop trying, that's hurtful and it's not helping. However, if someone said to you, look, I noticed that you really struggled when installing the operating system because you kept forgetting how to partition the hard drive because you were skipping through the steps. That's negative feedback, but it's presented less hurtfully. And from that negative feedback where I said, look, you really struggled partitioning the hard drive, we need to sit down and let's go through this again. Feedback is only useful if you're able to grow from it. So if you are providing or receiving that negative feedback, make sure it's coupled with areas or strategies for actually improving. So we've now spoken formal and informal, direct and indirect, positive and negative. Now I'm going to tell you, how do you actually get feedback? There are two types of feedback here. Sometimes bosses want to know how their workers are going, so they might want to get feedback like that. Other times, workers want to know what their bosses think of them because they want to know whether they're doing well at their jobs. There's a couple different strategies that we can use to get feedback. The first is surveys. Surveys are a really easy way. Ask a few questions, answer those, and then we can get statistical analysis of how people are going. Surveys and questionnaires are pretty impersonal. They're usually very generic. They're great for large data sets, but if you're trying to get feedback for one specific person, a survey quite often isn't very helpful. It might be best to chat to them and get the feedback verbally. Another way to get feedback is while you're presenting to groups. Okay? It could be a matter of presenting some information to someone. Maybe it's like your teacher during class. Maybe it's like this video right now. And then asking people a couple of questions at the end to see whether they've understood it. And that could be through a survey, it could be through conversation, it could be through written responses, just to see how they've understood it and how they've interpreted it. Another way to get feedback is research, okay? Actually going and investigating data that's being collected, comparing it to historical data to see if you're improving, and then using that as a basis for improving. But really, a lot of the feedback comes from speaking to people and being open, being honest, and this can be done through meetings or through interviews, face-to-face manner where 2 or more people come together to discuss things. It's where you get to ask questions, get a little bit of feedback, and it's not just the things that people say that help you get that feedback, but it's their way that they use their body language gives you feedback. So one of the things that's really frustrating as a teacher in this online learning environment is, well, I can't see if my students understand what I'm talking about because I can't see their faces. But when you're sitting in front of me and I can see your face while I'm talking, when I see that really confused face where you sort of squint your eyes up and look off into the distance, I know that you're confused, and I know that I have to try and explain this in a better way. Okay? So interviews provide the benefit of both getting the verbal feedback, getting the information from the person, usually a little bit more informally, but it also gives those extra little clues of information like facial expressions and hand gestures to understand people's thoughts and feelings about a matter. Okay, so that's feedback. If you're at work and you want to know how you're doing, you cannot get in trouble for asking your boss to give you a bit of feedback. And one of the strategies I'd say you use there is go and speak to them or send them an email and say, can we book in a time to have a bit of a review of how I've been performing lately? I've been working really hard on this, and I want to know what you think as well. Okay? So actually asking for that feedback is the best way to get feedback when you're at work. Now, the last thing that I'm going to talk to you about when we're talking work practices is customer service. Customer service is that way that we interact with the customers of our business. It includes not just the things that we say, but the way that we say them and the way we present ourselves when we're saying them. we are preparing you to work in effectively an IT service desk role. That's the basis of what we're preparing you for. And I highlight an IT service desk role, which means we are preparing you for service. We want you to provide a service to our customers. And our service is helping them with their computer issues, essentially. Our customers should leave the conversation with you feeling like you care for them and that you are trying to fix their issue or have fixed their issue. People should not leave a conversation with an IT service desk and be like, oh, that was so exhausting, I might as well just fix it myself. Because that then means we haven't provided the level of service that we should be. There are some ways that we establish good quality service, and it's about our professional language, about being clear and consistent in the language that we use, using things like plain English. But it's not just the way we communicate, it's the way we interpret communication. So actually listening to the client and actively listening to them. Questioning them to confirm your own understanding of what they're trying to share with you. It's about providing honest, genuine care, making the customer feel like they're valued, following up on questions, and at the end, once the computer's fixed, just checking that, is that everything you need from us today? Is the computer working the way you expected it to? And if you're not able to solve it, don't just say, it's too hard for me, but actually refer them on to the next level of support that they need and help them along that process. It's not good enough to be unprofessional if you are in an IT service role. So look, that's been about 20 minutes so far, and I'm going to cut it about there. It's been a really full-on presentation, but work practices, there's a lot in there because it's the way that we do our jobs. Okay, so I hope that one's been helpful. Make sure you've updated your notes. Couple questions there, answer them on the module, submit them when you're done, and that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.